Hello, Regent Park. My name is Minerva Navaska. Please welcome Max Mishler, a history professor from the University of Toronto. Welcome, Max. How are you doing today?
I am great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being on here. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a assistant professor of history at the University of Toronto, which is a fancy way of saying I teach people things. And I'm a teacher first and foremost, and a researcher too. So I teach courses on American history, and in particular, history of slavery, emancipation, incarceration, history of social movements.
Mhm.
And I also teach courses broadly on sort of power, resistance, and a whole range of other topics. As a researcher, I write about the history of incarceration in the 18th, 19th century Atlantic world, so the United States, Europe, Caribbean, Africa.
Mhm.
And my first book is about the relationship between the gradual destruction of slavery, chattel slavery, in the long 19th century, and the consolidation of penal servitude or the penitentiary. And what I'm interested in is why, at the precise moment that we have the ending of one kind of unfreedom, right, slavery, do we have the simultaneous consolidation of another form? And my argument is that in answering that question, we can come to make sense of how is it that a place like the United States developed a carceral state capable of incapacitating millions of people, right? How do we have a nation that claims to be so free and has so many people that are not free? So that's kind of what I write about. I
That's
also write about social movements, as I mentioned, and um, also the history of drugs, which we don't have to get into, but sort of,
uh-huh.
uh, which is related, of course, right? Because
Yeah.
one of the main justifications for the policing, prosecution, and incarceration of people of color is the so-called drug war, has been the so-called drug war.
Mhm.
That's what I work on.
Well, that's great. I wanted to ask, since you are very focused on what has happened in the past, why do you believe that it is important for us and everyone in society to learn about our history?
Well,
How does that affect us?
there's a very common phrase that you hear sometimes, not just in activist circles, but
Mhm.
just among family and friends. And you've probably heard it, right? If you
Mhm.
don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Mhm.
And that people like that. And so I don't want to say they shouldn't use it, but it's always struck me as a little bit off. And that is, as a historian, I don't actually believe that history repeats itself.
Mhm.
Rather, I believe that history is always changing. And the purpose of learning history is not so much so that you don't repeat it, but the purpose of learning history is to understand how have certain people in the past gathered enough power to exploit and exclude other people. How
Mhm.
did those people who were excluded and exploited respond to their condition? How did they change it if they could? And
Mhm.
what are the lessons of that battle for us today?
Mhm.
Right? How did people survive and how did people transcend? And I think that's the importance of history, is
Mhm.
that it helps give you a sense of how we got here from A to B,
Mhm.
right? And the part of that I think sometimes gets lost is that history can teach you a lot, but it doesn't always yield stories that align perfectly with the demands of the present.
Mhm.
In other words, history, if you go back into the past and you try to just pick out stories that support your argument about today, right, you'll find them.
Yeah.
But in not talking about the other stories, you're presenting an incomplete picture. And to my mind, if you're doing that about the past, you're probably presenting an incomplete picture of the present too.
Mhm.
So history is both useful for what it teaches us, but it's useful as a methodology that we
Uh-huh.
can apply to our own moments as much as we can apply it to the past.
It's very interesting. Well, speaking of leaving out part of the
Mhm.
whole picture, do you believe that not just in the post-secondary world, but even in middle school or in secondary schooling, do you believe that the histories of BIPOC communities and individuals are often left out in curriculums?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
unequivocally so.
Mm-hmm.
And we shouldn't be surprised by it. We have to be clear that the school shares a genealogy with the prison and that both of them are part of this project called the nation.
Hmm.
right? Schools are created to help mold citizens or subjects who believe in a nation, a national past. And the problem with national histories almost everywhere is that to conceive of a nation requires the exclusion of those upon whose land and through whose bodies the nation was constructed, and right, often requires marginalizing those people who are within the nation but represent a problem for the nation because of who they are, where they come from, what language they speak, how they look. And so I say that to say that yes, there are certainly, from kindergarten through college, there are if not intentional, nevertheless overt exclusions of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color histories, no doubt about it. But that we shouldn't pretend that that's an anomaly with an otherwise good system. I'm trying to suggest that the schoolhouse as a system has been critical to the exclusion. And the classic example in Canada, but also in the United States, of course, are the residential schools, right? Where schooling was not about teaching them to be citizens in a meaningful sense or mobility. It was about cultural genocide, right? So when that's the origin of the schoolhouse, we have a lot of work to do to reframe education as something liberatory and inclusive and I hesitate to use the word progressive, but I'll use this, or progressive.
Well, since Canada is typically looked upon, especially by the United States, as a more progressive country, and with our leaders emphasizing the necessity for diversity, why do you think this is still a problem in our schooling? Why do you think we haven't moved past
one of the things I've learned from activists and scholars of color here in Canada and my colleagues who work on Canadian history. In fact, U of T, we just hired a brilliant historian of Black Canada who writes about education, who's going to really make a big difference to addressing some of this. But one of the things I've learned from them is that, you know, Canada's ideology of multiculturalism, right? It's so ideology in this case is something that Canada says about itself. We are multicultural. But within that multiculturalism is a whole set of exclusions and a hierarchy of who's better than who, right? And which stories get to matter. And if you're not a white Canadian, or if you're not descended from that kind of settler colonist, if you're an immigrant or a person of color, a Black Canadian, and you try to tell a story that disrupts multiculturalism, you will be marginalized and silenced. Right? So the story of multiculturalism is not in and of itself bad, although some of my friends and colleagues might disagree with that. I don't think it's necessarily bad. I would just say that if there's no space within it for people to disrupt it and offer their own interpretations, then it becomes just like dress, right? It's like, it's almost, think of it like the drag of multiculturalism. Canada puts on multiculturalism, it wears it, but it doesn't really inhabit it because it still requires you to accept certain myths about the nation and its origin and the role of Canada internationally that are not actually inclusive. They're not just, right? And so I think that's where some of the tension comes into play. We have a story Canada likes to tell about itself, but that story doesn't line up with what happened or what's happening now.
So how do you believe leaving out the histories and perspectives of BIPOC individuals and cultures, how does this damage or impact the students that are supposed to be learning about them?
Well, let me just say, it damages everyone, right? But first and foremost, it damages those students who are Black and Indigenous or of color. And so my primary concern would be, if you're telling a story that in telling it reproduces the marginalization of your students, that's not just misguided, that's harmful, that's wrong,
Mm-hmm.
Right? They shouldn't do that. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think we have to be very clear, and scholars of education have made this point over and over again. When you don't teach this history, it has a negative impact long term on students' success rates in high school and college. It convinces young people that, for example, becoming a historian is not something that they should do. Why would you want to become a historian if history is not about your people, if your people are not part of history, right? Why would you want to become uh, a chemist or a physicist if your sense is that science and math are exclusively for white thinkers? Why would you want to become a philosopher if you think that philosophy is European men arguing about rights in the 18th century? So by not including the history of um, 95% of the world, right? Non-white people in the world who've made enormous contributions to almost every field of knowledge, and whose history is the history of the majority of the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a kind of act of what we might call epistemological violence that's acted out on students every day, and it has consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And secondarily, it's bad for all of us. It's
Mm-hmm.
bad for white students. It's bad for white parents. It's bad for everyone to not get a complete picture of where we come from.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think that's what some of the impact is material and psychological, and some of it is more broadly very damaging to building an actually inclusive society.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more about BIPOC
Mhm.
individuals and communities getting access to education. Do you
Mhm.
believe that there are obstacles that these communities and these individuals are encountering that are not apparent to their white neighbors?
Absolutely. And one of the main ones is, every time a parent or student speaks up about whether it's curriculum or any question of equity, they almost invariably are perceived as angry, as disruptive, as problems. So the problem is sort of problematizing the very act of trying to get equity discourages it,
Mm-hmm.
right? It harms people's health. If every time you go to your school, you want to make a statement, you try to you try to get teachers and administrators to take, for example, Black history seriously, and every time you go, you get dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
That has consequences on your mental health,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there are enormous obstacles to getting, quality education that really addresses people's history. When every time you try to raise it, you get shut down,
Mm-hmm.
or when your demands are perceived as outside the norm of what's acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are those obstacles. There's
Mm-hmm.
also a real disconnect in terms of resources, and here I think, frankly, university faculty, including myself, we've all kind of dropped the ball a little bit, and that is there are conversations going on at the university level that are very rich and robust about history of Indigenous people in Canada and around the world, history of Black Canadians and the African diaspora, history of Asian migration globally, right, or Southeast Asia. I mean, there's just enormous work being done, but we don't always do a good job of bringing that work to the community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about this summer in particular is what are the kind of obligations those of us in the university have to bring the conversations taking place at the university into communities where people affected by this work live. I
Mm-hmm.
think we do have that obligation. So those are two that I can think of: the sort of the structural barriers within school systems, and then finding ways to actually bring the work that is being done on this to those communities.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit more about gaining access to education in general, not just the
Mhm.
historical side of it. Do you, especially with post-secondary and the cost of tuition, things like that, does that add on to the amount of obstacles that these individuals face?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, we have to be very clear. You know, we live in a capitalist society, and within a capitalist society, there's inequality.
Mm-hmm.
However, that inequality is always fractured, right? or refracted through race, gender, status. And so what that means is, like in University of Toronto system, most of our students are working class. They work and they go to school.
Mm-hmm.
That's especially true for students of color.
Mm-hmm.
So not only are our students of color, many of them, though not all, but many of them, they live, if they go to school downtown at St. George campus, they live far from campus.
Mm-hmm.
They work often full-time jobs. Mm-hmm. Then they also have to take care of family members. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, what school ends up becoming, this idea that, you go to college and you sit in a grassy knoll and you read and you kind of have fun, that's the dream. But for many of our students for many of our students of color, it's a third job. Mm-hmm. It's like they have school, then they have work, then they have family. And so those kinds of structural demands on people's time, I think, make it difficult to get the full immersive experience of college education. Mm-hmm. In some cases, that plus the cost pushes people out of higher education. They say things to themselves, why would I invest? What am I going to get out of this degree? And maybe I should go do something else. Mm-hmm. And so while they're making those calculations, wealthier students, oftentimes wealthier, whiter students, they never even have to ask. Mm-hmm. The question never crosses their mind, should I stay or should I go? They take for granted that they're going to be there. They take for granted that families will back them up, that tuition will be covered, that housing will be covered. They don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't need to have a PhD, right, to know that if you have 2 students and one of them works full-time and takes care of family and can't afford tuition, and another one doesn't have to take care of family, doesn't have to work, and doesn't have to worry about tuition, barring some miracle, they're going to have different trajectories in college. So there are some profound structural inequities that affect Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities' access to higher education. No doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. And does the hindering of higher academic pursuits, what kind of impact does that have on future generations or lower income communities as a whole?
Well, one, so there's a material question here, which is, being a professor is not a bad job. Mm-hmm. So it's one way to think about being a professor is we think of ourselves as somehow superior, but it's like a union carpenter, right? Or a lawyer. These are good jobs. They pay well. They have benefits. So if there's no route for students of color to go from being students to becoming academics or pursuing graduate degrees, then they're also being excluded from good jobs. Mm-hmm. Right? So they're losing an opportunity to have a good career. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. The second part of it is the less diverse your faculty, the more students of color in higher education start to identify the professor, right, with a white guy. Mm-hmm. So they think when they hear the word professor, they think someone that kind of looks like me, but probably a little older. Uh-huh. They don't think about a woman of African descent. They don't think about an Asian Canadian woman. They don't think about someone who is, say, from Haiti and speaks French and lives in Montreal. That's not who they imagine as a professor, right? So part of why it's important, which is just one of the many reasons why diversifying faculty is a really important thing, is that then our students start to associate themselves with the possibility of becoming professors. Mm-hmm. And for someone like myself who is white, that means, therefore, I have to find ways in my courses to bring in faculty of color as either guest speakers, use writings by faculty of color and make it clear that that's who's writing it, mm-hmm. in order to help people understand that there are many different voices and perspectives, many of which are being produced by people of color, and that they have a right, as much of a right as anyone else, to be at the table talking about ideas.
Mm-hmm. So who are the people that are able to push those within the lower income to receive a higher level of education, and in what ways are they trying to push for this?
I don't know. I think there are programs. Toronto has a transition year program, which is really, I don't know much about it, but it seems really awesome. And the people I know that work with it are incredible faculty members. So the idea being, if you were at a high school, and this goes back to an earlier point, the number, just to give you an example, the number of women and women of color and even men of color who I know in who are academics, who were told by high school guidance counselors that they should pursue, they should think about going to nursing school, or they should think about becoming a tradesman, a plumber, when they were like exceptionally gifted, right? So assuming you can overcome that, then you have to deal with the fact that students from poor areas are almost universally underserved in their schools, which means they're less prepared for college work, right? So these transitional year programs, what they try to do is help those students, or students who went to work and are now returning to school, help them develop the academic skills to stay in school and succeed. Mm-hmm. So programs like that are really important. There are programs in high schools that are geared towards teaching students about the different kinds of schools that are out there, to think about a major. I think families play an important role, but I don't want to overemphasize that too much, because there's this idea out there that people that do well in school is because their family valued education. And I think that's a very dangerous and frankly racist idea. But nevertheless, parents, mentors, there's a whole range of people and institutions that can help push people into higher education. All that being said, if we as a society and then our representatives in government determined that higher education is a right that all of our young citizens should have, and we made it accessible economically, and we built dorms where they could live, and we facilitated work-study jobs that allowed them to survive, that would be the single most important way to promote higher education among young people.
To the Regent Park community, thank you for tuning into this week's show. I hope that through learning our own histories, we are better able to celebrate our own cultures. I also hope it helps us take a stronger stance for the movements that we are a part of. We are not the first to fight for equality, and we sure won't be the last.
Please do not forget to like, comment, and share to our channel. Follow us on all our social media platforms. And for more information, please check out our website.